Education, especially education for children, maximizing the potential of kids into our world. How do we best do that? And we'll be unpacking the nuance of that with two very brilliant panelists. First, to my left is Vicki. Vicki Alger is a research fellow at the Independent Institute in Oakland and holds senior fellowships at the Fraser Institute, headquartered in Vancouver, and Independent Women's Forum in Washington, D.C. So, her research focuses on education reform that promote a competitive education marketplace and increase parents' control over their children's education, which actually I learned earlier that Arizona is one of the leading parental control over education states, which was really interesting, and Florida's up there too.
Yes, we have friendly competition between Arizona and Florida.
And then she's also advised the U.S. Department of Education on public school choice and higher education reform, and she's the author of more than 40 education policy studies and 4 books, most recently, Failure, The Federal Miseducation of America's Children. And then Carol Kocivar has worked to improve public education ever since her 2 children attended public schools in San Francisco. She's past president of the California State PTA and has advocated for adequate school funding, small class sizes, arts for all children, special education funding, physical education and counselors, civics education, and the defeat of vouchers. She has worked as a journalist, an attorney, and ombudsperson for special education. She hosts Looking at Education on KALW Radio 91.7 FM and SF, and is a writer for ed100.org, a web resource to create informed parent leaders. Yes. So this is one of the most pressing issues that we face, is figuring out how to educate children into our world. And what are, I guess, the basics that we need to know about figuring out how to educate kids into our world? Is this a public good? Should this be made available to everybody? And how should it be made available to everybody? The quality of education?
Well, I'd like to defer to my host from San Francisco.
The answer is yes. Public education, education for all children, education so that every child has an opportunity to develop, to learn not only English and math and science, but learn how to work with other children, learn about the importance of responsibility, civic responsibility. I think that that probably is the most important role that we have as citizens, and that is educating the next generation. So yes, the answer is yes, it's important.
And then maybe a follow-up to that is then how would, and you can chime in here, would be how do we then fund and provide equal opportunity for all kids in all socioeconomic statuses?
Well, I would say that Carol and I absolutely agree on that point. And one thing that was interesting to me in researching my book Failure is, did we always educate children the way we do today? And the answer is absolutely not. At the beginning of our republic, it was very diverse. And so you have so many, much of the research is in the original colonies. There's less data on the South. But what was very interesting is every community, every township was very unique. And I'm originally from Boston, so I like to pick on Boston a wee bit. And so it was interesting in Boston, they started doing research. I call them the Boston busybodies, because we were very worried about, oh my goodness, we don't have a system. We don't track children. We don't know, what about the poor children? And so the Boston busybodies did a survey about where are all these poor children going to school, and are parents sending their children to school? Well, guess what the results of the survey were? 98% of the children, poor, regardless of socioeconomic status, were actually being educated. Now, the way they were being educated was there were schools, there were tutors. If families could not afford, because everything was, you have to pay for something, there was no system of publicly financing all children being educated. And so once they got the results back, it's like, ooh, this doesn't really fit our agenda. If there has to be an expert in charge. so then they said, well, we really need experts because we can't trust these parents or these private entities or these private tutors or, heaven forbid, religious organizations contributing. So we would agree on there should be universal education. Where I think there may be disagreement is who, through whom do we fund it, and should government be involved? Because one thing, being in San Francisco, I like to acknowledge that this was the place that Nobel laureate economist Milton Friedman chose to call home. And to summarize, just because we fund schools through government doesn't mean that government knows what's best for over 50 million of other people's children. And I think we've gone down a path where, out of genuine concern to make sure that all children have access to education, it's been homogenized. It doesn't work for all children, yet we don't allow them an escape hatch. So I think that's where the conversation needs to happen. How can we achieve equity, access, and affordability, and really excellent education for all children?
Yes, well said. We had the pleasure of being at the South End Tech Center in Boston, Mel King and Susan Klimczak's project. And we had a chance to interview them. And I mean, their main point is that the closer that children are to the information superhighway, and the more that they have access to that, the better their life outcome is. And so then how to provide the educational superhighway, this informational superhighway next to every child, is a choice of government helping 50 million kids, private industry coming in, making free. We also work with the CK-12 Foundation, which provides amazing simulations and across physics and chemistry and all these different sciences. So how should we figure out what is best for every individual child?
Well, I think you've hit upon the point of disagreement. And my sense is that as a country, as a community, our most important responsibility as a government is to make sure all of our children have access to a quality education. Now, of course, we look at the history of the world. Things don't always work out. There always can be improvement. But the ideal, the sense that we and our government, and I use the government meaning us as a community, have a responsibility to make sure that we meet the needs of all of our children. If you take a little look at some of the history, it wasn't always that all children had access to school. It wasn't always, particularly if we look at children with special needs or disabilities, that they had access to schools. And I think it's very important that there be a commitment on the part of all of us that our government provide a free, appropriate public education for every single child. And I think we disagree in some ways, but I don't think we disagree on some things. And some of the things I think that we would agree on, is we're not disagreeing on whether or not there should be choice. Because there is a lot of choice within a strong public education system. If you look here in San Francisco, our whole school system is a system of choice. We have magnet schools, we have language schools, we have schools that specialize in the art, and children have an opportunity to choose to go to those kinds of schools. When I came to San Francisco, one of the reasons that I moved to San Francisco was there was choice within our public school system of absolutely excellent schools. And so my children had the opportunity to go through, I thought, absolutely terrific public schools here in San Francisco. So I think that it is a difference in thought. I don't believe, quite frankly, that when you say that we have to have all our children on the information superhighway, that's the way you choose to teach young children. You don't teach young children by putting them in front of a computer and hoping that they learn. There are lots of responsibilities that we have to teach children, and they have to do with interacting,
Definitely.
understanding the rules, how to get along with each other, knowing discipline, and all of that, I don't believe you learn on the information superhighway plugged into technology. So I think that is totally the wrong direction for public education. You can use technology, but technology does not replace a highly qualified teacher who knows the subject matter, who has been taught to work with children. So I think that is an entirely wrong direction for our country. We can use the technology, but it is not a replacement for high-quality public education.
Vicki, what do you think?
Well, I think Carol brings up so many really important points. So I'd like to actually walk backwards, if I may. One of the things that's an issue that's particularly close to my heart, not just when I first started out in research, but also from firsthand personal experience, it's become even more personal, is the issue of special education. And one thing that's so frustrating to me is when parents who, if they're in their chosen public district or public charter school and their children are receiving through their individualized education plans or programs, the programs and services that are working for them, amen, that is fantastic. But in far too many cases, parents who are in a government schooling system and their parents can see that their children are not flourishing, the services and the education provided to their children with special needs are not working for their children. And no, you do not have to have an alphabet soup of letters after your name to know that my kid can't read, my kid is frustrated, they're having meltdowns every night. And they go and try and work within the public or government system, and they're up against, it's really a David and Goliath situation, because parents do not have $30,000 to $50,000 you're going to need to get the lawyers. One of the only increases in litigation with public school litigation with parents is special needs, because parents are fighting tooth and nail. They are giving everything they have and more, going into huge debt just to get their kids who have special needs into the programs that work. Absolutely false. And one thing that, I'm just going to be very candid right here, makes my blood boil when I have to go before various committees, state committees, testifying about education savings accounts or scholarship programs, whether it's tax credit, which is privately financed scholarship programs, or publicly financed voucher programs, depending on the state and what's allowable under their constitution. I hear free and appropriate education, or FAPE. Well, you don't have the protections under IDEA. You know what I want to say to that? You do not get a gold star because it took an act of Congress to force public schools to accept children with special needs. And some of the most compelling testimony, and I would urge you to read it, is actually someone in Bill Clinton's administration who has polio and said, I was kept out of New York public schools. That's where I wanted to go. I had to go to the Catholic schools to receive my education because I was in a wheelchair and I was told I was at a fire hazard. So in 1975, we passed what is now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which guarantees a free and appropriate public education to all children. The reason it took an act of Congress is because millions of children were being turned away from public or government schools because they had disabilities. So I am all for, if a district school works for you, fantastic. Charter school, homeschool, online school, or through education savings accounts, which Arizona, I'm very proud that my home state was the first in the nation in 2011 to have education savings accounts, which gave parents just 90% of their state funding, their state formula funding, not the local, not specialized local or state funding or federal funding, to get their special education children the combination of services that would work for them. And guess what? Not only did they get the tutoring and the services that they needed, they had money left over. And you know what the satisfaction rate was from that education savings account program when parents were just given a fraction of what other children would get. It was 100%. 100%. Show me another program anywhere in any marketplace or any aspect of our lives where you have 100%. So I understand the ideals of IDEA. It is not working for a lot of families, and a lot of families are shut out because they do not have access to the big, high-powered attorneys to fight the system, and it takes years to go into court to get their kids the services they need. So if the government system is working, fantastic, more power to them. But if it's not, do not keep these children trapped. Give them education savings accounts to get the products and services and curricula they need.
So I want to address maybe what Carol said earlier about emotional intelligence education as well. This seems to be more and more of a growing importance in our world. A lot of logic can be automated with software, not so much emotion. It's more difficult to automate emotion. So the proximity of very high-level teachers to students is crucial for the students' development, as is technology, access to computers for the ones that do want to pursue that. Obviously, you only have a limited amount of high-level teachers, and you have a lot of students. So it's difficult, I guess, to figure out how to enable the teachers that are very high-level to educate as many students, or to create better teachers in that sense for students. And just to piggyback off what you were saying, Vicki, however we end up funding schools, this is something property taxes are paying for public schools. There's more Pacific Heights versus Bayview in San Francisco is just a good way to put that into perspective.
Well, I think maybe I'll
teach me.
help you a little bit on
that.
that.
Yeah, please.
Because in California, we have a combination of funding for our public schools. And what actually happens is that we have a level that is set at the state. So if your property taxes don't meet that level, the state fills it in so that you get a basic level of funding.
And then on top of that, for wealthier neighborhoods, they get...
No, absolutely wrong.
Oh, they get cut?
Absolutely wrong. So there was and I think this is probably one of the most important things that's happened to public education. And it started out with an idea called weighted student formula. And that means that kids who have greater needs get more funding. They generate more funding. And here in San Francisco, we actually started that before the state changed that. And so now what we have is a system that every school child, every child generates a certain amount of money, regardless of whether you live in Bayview or you live in Pacific Heights. But if you happen to be a foster child, or you happen to be an English language learner, or you happen to be low socioeconomics, you generate more money. And so in fact, schools that have high percentages of our most needy children get considerably more money. So that a child who lives in a school that has a lot of children, that school has thousands and thousands of dollars more per student than a school that doesn't have children that generate that money. So your premise is incorrect.
But the parents can also help supplement, right? The wealthy parents can supplement their education financing. No, they can't?
Well, parents can donate money to a school. And I think one of the strongest correlations between how well kids do is income of parents and the education of a mother. Mm-hmm. And so there's been a lot of study that says, you know, if your mother has a college degree and had read to your child will be better prepared for school. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why, in addition to having a weighted student formula, we're moving to much greater investment in early education because we know that there is a huge disparity between the opportunity of a child who lives in Pacific Heights and a child who lives in an area where the income is lower. And so a very important investment that we should be making as communities is investment in early education for all our children. So all of our children have the opportunity to learn, and when they get to kindergarten, they're not behind. And so I think that's a very essential role of our communities and our state to ensure that we do everything we can to even the playing field so that children come to school ready to learn.
And I would say it's very interesting listening to Carol because obviously the research is very interesting on this point. And I was thinking, wow, my mother was a high school dropout who made Harvard professors cry. She's part of an artist commune, and she dropped out because her father died, so she was being raised by a single mom who had an 8th grade education. By the way, we're the Boston Irish Catholics who were responsible for Blaine amendments. So if you want to know why you can't have vouchers for K-12, but you can't have them for higher education, yeah, my people are partially responsible for that.
So why don't we just explain, because people might not know what the Blaine Amendment is.
Oh, thank you. Yes, yes. The Blaine Amendment, they're what I would consider blights on our state constitutions, many of our state constitutions, particularly in the western states, that say no public funding for private education at the K-12 level. Of course, in college, 18-year-olds can take public dollars and go wherever they want, public, private, religious, non-religious.
See, we're looking at the same glass. She says it's half empty, and I say it's more than half full, because I think that making sure that public money goes to pay for public education is probably one of the most important principles of education, and that it shouldn't be diverted for private profit to pay for private and religious schools. And so I think we'll agree to disagree.
Oh, yeah. But I would like to bring up something that's really unique about California's history, pardon me, because when we're going into what are called the equity lawsuits starting in the early 70s, and I had the distinct pleasure of meeting personally some of the lawyers. Off the record, he called himself we Bolsheviks from Berkeley, who fought those equity lawsuits and who were responsible for really driving across the country the fact that different children in different parts of the state cost more. Not all areas, pardon me, have the same property wealth. And I love that sort of equity. But here's what's very interesting about folks who oppose vouchers which are publicly financed scholarships at the K-12 level, not at the higher ed level, because I don't hear these same people voting against or railing against Pell Grants or the GI Bill. If you look at that case in California, the judge actually said, because the ones who litigated the case said, we would like, in essence, Pell Grants for K-12 kids, because we would break down those economic barriers to equality. So kids could take that money and just go to school. It goes all the way back to Thomas Paine. Take that money and go to school. We don't care where you're educated, just get educated. And talking about
Can I jump in for a second?
Yes, because I want to follow on. I want to
ahead.
follow on about the weighted student formula because it's so important. And one thing that I am really surprised about, that in California, you don't have disability weights in your formula. You've just converted to the local control formula. You don't have various categories of disabilities.
Well, I can address that too. But
let's go to that, please.
Let's go back a little bit to your discussion of vouchers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about people getting money, taking public money to go to a private school, and here's the big difference. Public schools are open to everyone. You don't have to pay to go to a public school. Private schools, they pick and choose. They can decide whether or not they're going to accept you. And so I think your argument is not an equity argument, because poor children who don't have enough money to pay for the tuition and the vouchers that people provided certainly weren't close to the $40,000 or $50,000 you're paying for an expensive independent school here in San Francisco. It's a no-go. And in fact, what we have had twice in California, because this was such an interesting issue, is we put it by initiative to the public. And the public twice overwhelmingly said public money should pay for public schools. And that is the direction that we have been working on.
And I really appreciate you bringing up the initiatives and the debates, because they're important debates. And can I tell you how nice it is to be up here? And we clearly do not see, we share very different points of view. I'm glad not once you said, why do you hate children? Because so many times it's, why do you hate public education? Why do you hate this? I just wanted to interject and say I appreciate that. But I'd like to, because we hear these debates, and they're debates we're going to hear much more frequently.
Where's the specific place that you disagree, though?
Let me just jump in
Okay.
for a second. And I think that there's something here that we all agree on, and that we all agree on passionately. And that is, we have to provide all of our children with a quality education. There is no disagreement. And I don't think that there's a heart in here that's saying, you know, you can't, don't do this one, don't do that one. We're here for a public good. And the reason I came here is because this really is one of the most important discussions that's happening in the nation. And it's about the direction of where we go with education. And I think it's important for us to be having this conversation about what that direction is. And I think we can talk a little bit, because I think it's one of the issues we have to talk about, is what do we do to make sure that we have quality schools? Because the issue, I don't think, is choice. Choice doesn't equal quality. Choice is, you can choose a bad school, you can choose a good school, you can choose something that's green, you can choose something that's red. It doesn't matter that it's the choice, it's the quality of the school. And I think that's what we need to be talking about.
And I want to have that conversation, but I want to jump back to 2 points. As you were saying, where do we disagree? First, I want to just go right to the jugular. Public schools are open to all. Those private schools that charge $40,000, which we'll get to in a moment, they pick and choose. Those are arguments we've been hearing for decades and decades and decades. Number one, if you're in the state of Arizona, actually, let me step back. I do not buy for a nanosecond, the argument that in a state that rations public education by kids' zip codes, where your parents can afford to live, is where you have your choices. Let's say that I'm in South San Francisco, but I want to go to one of the better public schools in San Francisco or other places. I maybe have more of a choice than in Sacramento or in LA, but guess who calls the shots? District officials. So do not tell me, when you still have a state, and this is, as you can hear my voice changing, this enrages me, that in the 21st century, we still ration education by where families can afford to live, is insane. You want to have better quality education, you want to have better educational opportunity, you want to desegregate schools, you want all of the good things that I think everyone in this room would agree on. Tear down the walls that keep kids segregated by where their parents can afford to live. Do not assign children an education based on zip codes. We could not come up with a stupider, more unjust system if we put all of our brains together. Second thing I want to address is this notion that, oh, those big bad $40,000 private schools that pick and choose. There are more than 63 non-public parental choice programs, where they are publicly funded vouchers, whether they are privately funded tax credit scholarship programs or educational savings accounts programs. The overwhelming majority of non-public schools who participate are religious, and some of them, just like all those private schools that DC politicians and presidents send their kids to, they are open to poor kids. So this cherry-picking argument is utter garbage, because the overwhelming majority of private schools that participate in choice programs, and I've done the research on it, it's not ability to pay, so I'm not going to accept that the pick and choose argument when we are in a state that rations education based on where families can afford to live.
And maybe a counter to that?
I guess I could. I just read this research put out by the Learning Policy Institute on school choice. And I thought it was very interesting because they looked at what are the kinds of choices that you have in a various system. And so there are many choices within a public school system. You can have a magnet school, you can have your neighborhood school, you can have a music school, you can have an art school, you can have a high school that does this certain thing, you can have a school that partners with a community college. There are lots of different ways of slicing and dicing public school choice. The other thing that I've just been looking at, and I think that what we just heard was sort of a conflagration of choice meeting quality. Because when you look, for example, at the data, and we can argue over this research or that research, but there is a large amount of research that looks at voucher programs, that looks at charter school programs, that looks at virtual school programs, that looks at for-profit school programs. And if I were sitting here and the research told me that, wow, this is the silver bullet. After 10 or 15 years, we have finally figured out the silver bullet. Well, the research tells us, hey folks, private school choice, vouchers, all of those are not a silver bullet. There are good charter schools. There are some good schools that take vouchers. Mostly, all the schools fall in the middle where they're about the same as your neighborhood public schools. And then there are loads of schools that go out of business that are terrible. And so the idea that there is some great synergy that this choice has over these last 15 or 20 years made a huge difference in the quality of school is something we have to get past. I think what we have to look at, and it's true for a public school, it's true for a private school, it's true for a charter school, there are certain things that we have to make sure that all our children have. One of them is a high-quality teacher. Mm-hmm. And whether you agree with it or disagree with it, I happen to think that a teacher who's trained to be a teacher and certified as a teacher probably is a little better than someone who is in a school who has never had any training to be a teacher. I think other things that are important is that we have to start, and this is an issue that's statewide and it's national, and that is that because of many economic forces, we have not been investing in our teachers. Teachers are paid considerably less than comparable people with college degrees. And so we have a teacher shortage. And one of the big changes that we have to look at in terms of private schools or public schools is investing in high-quality teachers. And so high-quality teachers is like number one on my list of making sure that our schools are doing well. And then, of course, we have to have, safe facilities. We have to have professional development. And we have to have, I believe, a broad curriculum that meets the needs of all of our children. And so when I look, for example, at what are some of the problems that we've had in our school system, it has been driven, and I think we agree on this, in large part, on a school system that has been pushed and shoved by high-stakes testing. And so I think the move away from high-stakes testing, the move towards more local control in your communities, the move for decisions to be made, engaging parents, all of those things are going to improve education. And one of I think the most important things that we have to talk about is engaged parents. Engaged, as someone who's been involved with the PTA for a long time, we know that parents who are engaged in their students' education, those kids do better. And so I think those are some points of agreement. Rather than arguing over some other issues, I think we need to look at what are those things that are common values.
And gosh, where to begin? So many good points. Really very important points. I think starting with engaged parents, and that is critically important. And I think, and that's why San Francisco, I think this is a good place to be having this conversation, because San Francisco, I think to a large extent more so than many other places in California, does give parents options. We may disagree on how many more options we could give parents, but I think involved parenthood starts from the very beginning of the choice about where your child, not just where your child goes to school, but how your child is educated. So for me, I'm going to tell you right now, you want to go to a government or district public school, great. Public charter school, homeschool, unschool, private school, religious school. Is it right for your child? That's all I care about. And the question of quality, because this is something that I have to tell you starts getting me very nervous. Because if you look at the folks who want to do high-stakes testing and argue about, well, we need Common Core, Goals 2000, whatever the silver bullet, because I think we both agree, there are no silver bullets in education.
Well, I think we would agree that there are some elements, when put together, create a quality school.
Oh, a quality school, certainly. You can't, no, certainly we can talk about that. But when we certainly look at the newspapers and the political realm, well, let's just find the one fix and then just get that seed, add water, and we can just replicate it. That's not how it works. But if we want to involve parents, we have to have options. And when we're going to talk about quality, quality is measured by each individual child and where they start from and where they can go. Parents who are children's first educators having a positive, cooperative working relationship with their children's teachers can get their children so much farther. And that's where I think the role of testing comes in the form of diagnostics. Here's where you started, here's where you go, here are the strengths, here are the weaknesses, let's work together. Take all of that training and all of that pedagogy and all of that experience, and let's work together. That's what's going to have children to succeed, and it has to be on a voluntary basis. So I think if we start there.
And I actually, this is sort of an interesting issue.
I have something really crucial to bring up as
Go
well.
ahead, we're out of time.
no.
We're getting there. Yeah, we're getting out almost close there. And there's definitely a couple things that that I think are really important to address before we do start opening up for Q&A. I think probably the most important thing is exponential technology. So we're now in an era of artificial intelligence and robotics, as well as biotechnology exploding, neurotechnology exploding, space technology, blockchain and cryptocurrency. All these different technologies are exploding into the world. And public schools and even private schools in many cases are just not equipped for this. A lot of parents' philosophies are just like, hey, I birthed this child into the world and I'm just going to drop it off at the curb and hope for the best. A lot of actually what we teach on our program is that it's actually more so that the parent is the deity to the child, that it's the parent's responsibility first and foremost to be an exceptional educator to the child, and then to have an augmented education extended from family and friends and teachers and community as well. So with this exponential technology age, it's becoming more and more along the lines of the little human that passes the Turing test. You can't tell whether it's a human or a robot that is available 24/7, full access to Wikipedia, fully customized to your child, available anytime, and teaching your child at home, on the road, wherever you are. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a lot of hooey.
I like the availability of information, but information is not education. Another thing, and I'm talking as a stepmom to 4 stepsons who are on the computer all the time, very closely monitored, by the way. The minor children are monitored. They're learning languages. They're learning all sorts of things. It's a wonderful opportunity. However, information isn't education. And another thing, I think, with all these tools, it breaks down so many barriers. So if you live in a rural area, my gosh, you can have access to an MIT professor. Really great possibilities. But I also want to be very careful because there are a lot of companies that are making lots of money off of children whose parents are not being informed, whether it's social emotional learning, adaptive learning, all these other things. My stepkiddos, for an example, are not for sale. They're not guinea pigs. And if you would like to advance research, we're happy to participate in research. I'm a researcher. Get our consent. So I think there are so many great possibilities. There could be great equalizers, but be very honest about what you're doing, what you're collecting about our kids, because the privacy concerns, privacy breaches, and what's being collected on people's children every day, and people making a profit off it. Okay, the profit is the secondary. I don't like it. What are you doing to people's children without parental consent? And then putting parents on the sideline. That's where parents have to be first and foremost involved.
So when I say it's a lot of hooey, a lot of what you said is I agree with. But I think that when we look at what is the purpose of education, the purpose is more than having a child who can, do high calculus and look up something at MIT or whatever it would be. I think the purpose of education is much broader.
But that's not what I said whatsoever, and
Yeah.
actually I didn't mention information being the key. I mentioned education being the key, and the abundance of any education across social or emotional or intellectual learning, accessed at any time, personalized to the student. This is a new era that we don't know it yet.
I'm not saying that there are not great possibilities, but I don't think that we should fool ourselves that technology is going to teach our children what it's like to go to school with someone who's a different religion or someone who looks differently than they are.
But this is already being done right now.
Or whose parents have different socioeconomics, or who speak a different language, or who have to learn how to work with other on projects, who have to learn what empathy is. All of those interpersonal skills require people. They require teachers. They require nurturing. And I don't think that any of that can be replaced by what you're talking about. I'm not saying that you can't use technology, but what I'm saying is the idea that that kind of technology will replace how do you socialize a 4 or 5-year-old to work and become a responsible citizen. I don't think it will. I think you need personal interaction.
I'm going to disagree because I'm actually living that right now. And I had some time to really live it during the country's largest teacher walkout in Arizona with my youngest stepson and my other stepsons to a degree. He's on that darn computer all the time. But it isn't just checking out. He is communicating with other people from all over the world. His Russian's better than mine, and I went to university for years to learn Russian. He picked it up in like a week.
Вы говорите по-русски?
Да, очень хорошо. Я очень рад. He learns languages. He learns computer technology. He can explain nuclear fission to me. So there actually is a way to personalize learning. And one thing that's, I'm being very cautious here because personalized learning, I think I understand the context, your meaning of it, you're meaning it. I like the idea that, and I'm thinking of my youngest stepson right now, it could apply to all of them, but I would really like the fact that just because he's going into middle school and he's not in high school, he can't be taking the advanced calculus that he's already doing and getting college credit. I would like him to have the opportunity and to be within groups, online communities, because online communities are communities and you do have that kind of diversity. Yes, it is a challenge having boys get off the computer, go out and actually have one-on-one non-wrestling interaction. So that's always a challenge. But I think there's huge possibility as long as, number one, it's voluntary, that the personalization is directed by parents without any other outside influences trying to gather data on social emotional
For
learning.
example, think about what your kid is learning right now, and your kid doesn't tell you everything that they're learning. It would take you weeks to even just start chipping away at what they're learning, versus machines learn very quickly about what your child's preferences are, and then they're able to further advance your child's education that way faster.
And I'd be okay with that as long as, number one, the parents, what's being collected is absolutely transparent. It's not going to the Department of Labor in DC, because I don't think children are worker bees. We don't have a planned economy. I don't want that. So that sort of feedback that is voluntary, not being collected, there can be some benefit of it, but I want to be very cautious about it.
So let me just jump in a little bit, because I'm not saying it's not an opportunity. I want to be clear about that, but I don't think it's a replacement either. And the other thing, I think there's a word of caution, because there has been a lot of research about virtual online charter schools that are primarily in the for-profit space. And the research is overwhelming in many ways. One of the things that it's found is that kids who are doing well, who are curious, who are self-starters, who are independent, that works better for them than for a child who's struggling. And the research also says that for a virtual school, virtual schools really don't do well unless there are frequent personal check-ins with real people in person looking at each other to help particularly the children that are struggling. And so for those virtual learning experiences, they work well for the child who's at the high end, who's highly motivated, but generally they don't work well for many of the children who are in those virtual schools who are struggling. The other thing that the research has been overwhelmingly clear about is that the results of how well children do in a virtual for-profit school are really much worse than how well children do in a nonprofit school in person. So there's a huge discrepancy. So when you start talking about, we're going to use technology magic and it's going to somehow do all of this stuff, I think that we have to remember that we're working with children who need support, reassurance, nurturing, and that sort of thing. And virtual online click an app, learn something is not a replacement for those interpersonal skills and sense of independence and that we need to develop in our children.
I think Carol brought up a good point, but I also want to make a clarification.
Can we do
Computers-
quick because I want to do one quick one.
We always need the interpersonal. Computers, technology, robots are never going to replace. But I just want to make a clarification about for-profit versus nonprofit. I've been on a board of a charter school, very successful charter school, that is now technically for-profit. It's a legal definition. It's just a legal designation that makes things easier. So I want to be careful of nonprofit versus for-profit. Hey, if you do a great job, educate my kid, and you can make a profit with my consent, I don't care about that. So I want to be very careful about the somehow, that making a profit is somehow evil in the education sector. It isn't evil anywhere else because making a profit is what pays the taxes that supports the public school sector. So I just want to be careful of that sort of language.
So we've chiseled away at 0.001% of what's going on in the education sector. It's so difficult to unpack everything in such a short period of time. What is maybe a really important takeaway that people can maybe make action on?
Do you want to go first?
Well,
You let
thank
me
you.
go first. I'll let you go first.
Thank you. I would say that don't believe in one size fits all. Don't believe in silver bullets. I think the best way to measure success of any educational setting is by each individual child. So are individual children flourishing? And do parents have optimal freedom, complete freedom over how and where their children are educated? That's a signal of success for me, and that's absolutely where we should be going.
It's a hard question. What should be the takeaway? I think that the takeaway for me is that as a community, we have a really important responsibility, and that is to educate all of our children. And that our community, and you may call them government schools, I like to call them public schools that are open to everyone, have a responsibility to meet the needs of every child wherever they live, whatever their income, whatever language they speak, whatever ability or disability that they have. That's what public education is for. And it is the entrance and the opportunity for all children to meet and gain the skills that they need to be successful adults. And my preference, obviously, is that public money be used to pay for public schools that are open to every child.
And just a thought from me, I really appreciate the understanding of information superhighways, education superhighways, because it's about expanding the mind to these new dimensions of thought. And I have no idea how to fund them and how to get them to all SES, but what I can say is that democratizing information and making it accessible to equal opportunity to that education is probably the most important takeaway from me. Thank you. Carol, Vicki, thank you so much for coming on to speak with us today.
Thank you.